Okay, I know we're still waiting for people to come in through the chat. I know it's a Tuesday afternoon. People are still kind of coming in from lunch, so we'll get started and wait for people to continue to join us. Welcome to today's edition of Homeroom with Education Leaders. Today we are talking about school infrastructure, which is very relevant considering the events of the last week or so. And so I'm really excited to have three wonderful panelists who are going to talk about this with us today. My name is Julia Cunningham. I am the Deputy Director of State Engagement here at the Hunt Institute. And joining us today, we have Mary Falardo, who is the Executive Director from the 21st Century School Fund, Aletta Garrett Fitzgerald, the Southern Regional Director for the Children's Defense Fund, and Dr. James Lane, who is the Superintendent for the Virginia Department of Education. All three of them are really well versed in this topic and are going to give us some great insight into what's going on in school infrastructure these days. And just a couple quick notes before we get started into our conversation. I mentioned a minute or so ago, if you do have any questions, please make sure to submit them into the Q&A, and we'll have a really good chunk of time later to get through a lot of those. Also, if you'd like to follow along on social media, please use the hashtag #EdHomeroom. We also have our Hunt Institute Twitter up in the top right corner there, so please feel free to follow along there. Also, if you are watching on Facebook or on YouTube down the road, please make sure to know that we at the Hunt Institute are able to answer any questions you might have, so please feel free to reach out to us if you have any questions as a follow-up. So with that in mind, I would like to get us started. And I am going to start us off by introducing Mary Falardo, who is, as I mentioned, with the 21st Century School Fund, who's going to share with us some context around what are we talking about? What does school infrastructure look like? What do we need to do to improve school infrastructure in states, in districts, and what are those different mechanisms that we have, particularly with the passing of the infrastructure bill. This is going to be a conversation that we hear about a lot, and would love, Mary, for you to start us off by kind of giving us a brief overview of what this looks like right now.
Thank you, Julia. Good afternoon, everyone, or good morning if folks are coming further west. One of the things we just put out and did the research on was the 2021 State of Our Schools. And Dylan and folks can make these slides available, and you'll be able to get to the document from that. So go on to the next slide. What we've looked at in the State of Our Schools is basically what are states, as reported by school districts, spending on maintenance and operations of their buildings and grounds, and what is their capital outlay. These would be the sort of periodic spending that happens on school facilities. And these are the two main areas of responsibility for obviously states and school districts, which is the maintenance and operation of plant, as they call it, and the capital improvements. Go on to the next slide. One of the things that I think is often underappreciated is how enormous the scale of our public school buildings and grounds are. Looking just at about 14,000 districts with 92,000 schools, we've got about 8.1 billion gross square feet of space. That's almost, it's 2.7 to 2.8 trillion dollars of current replacement value. So this is if you think about it as a real estate portfolio, this is enormous. Onto the next slide. It's also interesting to see that it's second only to highways in terms of state and local capital outlay. And so it's absolutely, and if you add it to higher education, it's almost equal to highways in terms of capital outlay. This is for the 5 years from FY14 to 18. Go on to the next slide. But one of the challenges for states and districts is that there is almost no federal money, and even the state share is particularly small as compared to looking at operations and the annual operating budgets of school districts. About 77% of capital outlay is paid for locally, 22% by states, and that tiny little share that is federal, you can see that about 40% of it is just disaster funding, and the other major portion which some states used, but most states, frankly, did not use very much of the ARA funding for capital outlay. Next slide. Contrast that to federal funding. This was in 2017, but in terms of capital outlay, it was about 26% funded federally, as compared to, you see, the 1% for school facilities. Next slide. So overall, what we're seeing is, and the focus here in the bold is on the gaps. But in some ways, I think what's more important is that we're actually spending about 54 billion a year on capital outlay and spending 56 billion a year on operations and maintenance. And so, what we see is there's a lot of effort going into school facilities, even as we still see, in order to modernize this infrastructure, that we really should be spending about 85 billion a year. Next slide. And I don't want to go into this deeply, but these next two slides, one on maintenance and operations and the one on capital, sort of break down for you, where we get how we calculate the gap with standard, the actual spending, and then the calculation per gap, which you can see is on a per student, on a per square foot basis, how these numbers break down. So this is on the maintenance and operation. Go ahead to the next slide, which will be the capital outlay. And go back one, just a second, Bill, and just so folks can see. So here's the same kind of detail for capital improvements. Go to the next slide. So one of the things that we were really interested in the study is, do we see the gaps and the effort the same from district to district? And this is where, we absolutely are not seeing that. But one of the things that struck me is how the high poverty districts and the medium poverty districts, these are the districts with over 33% of their students eligible for free and reduced lunch, that they were very close in terms of how much they were spending on a per school basis. And the low poverty districts were really quite a different story. So this number here, this 428,000, there is how much the school districts were spending per year on average for maintenance and operation of plant. The next slide is on from a capital perspective, but looking at 10 years, because capital is not a year-to-year thing. Sometimes you have lots of capital, sometimes you have none. But on average, again, the medium and the high districts were pretty close, and the low poverty districts really had to consider about 37, almost 40% more that they were spending per school on capital investments. Next slide. So one of the other things that's interesting is that for state by state, it's really varied. And we work closely with the National Council on School Facilities, with the state facility directors, and they were a part of the study. And what we can see is that, some states frankly, like Wyoming, New York State, Massachusetts have high levels of spending. And then there are other states, many through the Midwest, that don't fund at all. So you can see Wisconsin, Michigan, Indiana don't have any funding for school facilities at all. North Carolina, I know the Hunt Institute is there, has some funding. It used to do more funding of capital infrastructure, but is definitely a very, very low level as compared to what a state share would be in operating. Next slide. So one of the things that we did in this study is look at, what needs to happen at the local, state, and federal level to address the really severe needs that school districts have around their buildings and grounds. And it isn't just money. There's the way they're governed and how decisions are made. There's the funding, obviously, but there's also management issues. We need more training, better support for workforce that are in the classified jobs and maintenance and repair and energy management. We need to do far better job on our planning so that the first things are done first. And we need to have better data and information. We did this study based on fiscal data because there is not condition data We had inventory data from about half of the states, but half of the states don't collect it at all. And then there needs to be some kind of public accountability for the decisions that are made with what still is about 110 billion a year in outlay. So I encourage you to look at the report. There's good information, and there's also profiles for every state. We'll be happy to talk more about it later in the session. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mary. That was really helpful and really illuminating about a lot of the inequities that we're seeing around the country and in school infrastructure. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Superintendent Lane. And Superintendent, thinking about what Mary's told us about the different levers around this and what's happening around the country, can you talk a bit more specifically about what's going on in Virginia and what are you thinking about as the Commonwealth looks for to really move this work forward?
Yeah, thanks. And thanks, Julia, and Mary, thanks for the great information. I'll give it a kind of a high level summary, and then I'm going to take some of what Mary shared and dive a little bit deeper into, what the data actually looks like in Virginia. Our school divisions, especially our rural school divisions, are really concerned about the longevity of their facilities. And we've been hosting tours for policymakers to help everyone understand, we're getting to a point that it is very serious. We have a lot of older schools that either require upgrades or replacement. More than half of Virginia schools are over 50 years old. I'm going to show you some data on this, but to replace all of the schools over 50 years old, let's say, and I'm not suggesting that all would need replacement, but certainly they'll need renovation. It would be well over $24 billion necessary to replace just the schools over 50 years old. We have spent about $4 billion in new schools over the past decade, and then $3.3 billion on upgrades. And so you can see that and a lot of those new facilities, frankly, are for growth in certain areas and not for replacements necessarily. The main strategy to get schools funded in Virginia are with grants and loans, and I'll talk through some of those things that we do. But as you can see, funding is not keeping up with demand. And then we have a lot of interest in just making sure that our facilities also meet the needs of our 21st century learners. So with that, I am going to share some slides that digs in on this data a little bit. Let me do that. And so here is a little bit of data just to give you a sense of what we're seeing in enrollment. We're going to have modest enrollment over the next 5 years, 4%. But when you look into where that growth is happening, it further exacerbates the issue. So what you're likely to see is places like Fredericksburg and what we call Region 3, which is kind of the southern end of what we call Northern Virginia, and kind of heading into the DC circle. And then 4, Northern Virginia, which really is that area around Washington, DC, you can see that those areas are going to grow significantly over the next decade. But our more rural areas, Western Virginia, which is more like Roanoke, Southwest Virginia, which is on into Lee County, which is, I think, closer to 8 other state capitals than Richmond, to give you a sense of the expansiveness of Virginia. And Southside Virginia, which is the area kind of between Petersburg and Roanoke Rapids and west of there, are declining significantly. And so one of the trends that we've seen is we're seeing a lot of new schools in these high growth areas to meet the student enrollment demand. But in those localities that are declining in enrollment, we're not seeing any real major investment in new facilities. And I'll show you some of that data here in a moment. And just for perspective, we have about 1,800 schools, 1,100 elementary, 300 middle and high. And I mentioned that over half of our buildings are over 50 years old. And so you can see here by percentage what that looks like by level. And again, you can see elementaries are on the whole a little bit older than our middle and high schools and some of our, K-8 type schools. And then you can also see the breadth here of how this issue does impact us really across all regions. We have some schools as old as 184 years old, which is a pretty incredible number to think about when you think about construction standards 184 years ago. Now, that's not to suggest that there haven't been any renovations to that building in 200 years, but you can see pretty much across all of Virginia, with the exception of that, Fredericksburg and East Corridor, if you know Virginia, most of our schools have a median age of around 50 years old and a statewide median of 52 years old. And I'll explain some of that history and why that is, but think about all of the requirements that have come into a modern building in the last 52 years. The Americans with Disabilities Act alone was after that fact. So the other thing that we have heard is that 40% of our buildings are at or above capacity, another 30% nearing capacity. 78% of our buildings are reporting ADA compliance. Keep in mind, until there's a major renovation, it's only when they upgrade the school that they make those type of investments. And 15% of our schools have had to have major renovations since 2015. And here is a project that we did with the school divisions recently, just to find out, okay, I shared with you that we have maybe 25 billion in new school facility needs for schools over 25 years. Here's what they think that they need in the next 5 years. And that's not to suggest that any of this is funded, but you can see there's nearly 4 billion in new school needs in the next 5 years, nearly 3 billion in major renovations. And of course, a lot going on HVAC, which actually our ARP funds can help with. But I did this for our legislature, and I just thought this would be cool for the viewers to hear a little about, because there was a time where schools were more actively funded by state and federal governments. But that really changed in the 1930s, and Mary talked about this, not only at the federal level, but at the state level. And sorry, let me get that back to full screen. Oh, I hit the wrong button. And so in the 1930s in Virginia, they passed an act that essentially took the responsibility from school construction from the state government and gave it to localities, and the state picked up the cost of roads. That was the trade in the 1930s. But the reason you see a lot of schools built in that time frame between prior to the 1930s by the state government, and that actually moved in the 1930s and 40s to federal government, because we saw a huge investment during the Roosevelt years in schools. And I was visiting a school just the other day where the cornerstone was thanking President Roosevelt for the funds to have that school built. And that school is still in operation today. That shift towards the state and local shift from roads to schools happened not only in Virginia, but really around the nation in the 1930s. We were able to keep up pace through the 30s and 40s through the Federal Works Act. And then in the 50s, there were some major investments in schools. And then really after the 60s, it moved more towards loan strategies or smaller grants and things like this, which is why you see so many elementary schools across the nation that were built between 1954 and 1959. And so that movement towards loans, the shift towards localities was huge, but that movement towards loans really put a lot of extra onus on localities to fund schools versus the state and federal investment. And so, we've tried some things, obviously there's been some tax policy, there have been some grants, there have been the stimulus funds that Mary mentioned. And then, obviously there's a little bit of flexibility in some of the ESSER funds, but overall, dollar for dollar, the needed amount is not coming from federal and state sources. So at our state level, we have tried to keep up mostly with maintenance costs and some recurring school construction costs, but again, they're not keeping pace. And so after the recession in 2009, a lot of these funds basically got gutted. And just in the last couple of years are we starting to see the state's investment in facilities, even in operations and maintenance, coming back to bear. and that's what you can see here. Some of this was eliminated in earlier cycles. But I wanted to pause a minute and just talk about debt financing. As you can see here, local general obligation bonds are the number one strategy that schools use. We do have a pooled bond program that we can provide from the state, so they typically will get a lower rate, but rates are so low right now, there's not actually a huge benefit to localities going to the pooled bond programs because they're getting better rates in the market. And of course, bank loans. We do have literary fund loans, but those are capped at $7.5 million. I think when the literary fund was established decades ago, 7.5 million might have been enough to build a building. You cannot build a building for 7.5 million now. When you think about the cost of architecture, civil engineering, and then the actual construction of the building, even a moderately sized elementary school is coming between 25 and 35 million. And so one of the things that we try to do to drive modernization, and I'll talk about this, I think, later in our day, but is we do have state facilities guidelines that are at least the minimum standards of what should go into a school in this day and age. And if you were interested in learning more about those, please let me know. But I'll pause there. That's a little bit of the landscape. As you can see, huge needs, especially in our rural areas. We got growth needs in some of our more urban areas, and just local options with loans really being the only way to build schools. It's becoming more and more difficult to keep our schools modernized.
Thank you, and really good overview there. I did want to just, before we turn over to Aletta, really quickly point out Mary's point in the chat that, we're talking about when so many of these schools were built 50 years ago, and lead paint was legal 51 years ago, asbestos was used highly 50 years ago, lead pipes were legal 50 years ago. And, just thinking about that context as we talk about some of these really important health imperative upgrades that need to be made. So with that in mind, it's perfect transition over into Aletta. And so Aletta, I was hoping that you could talk a little bit about really thinking about leveraging federal actions, state actions, local actions, and policies to really think about the equity part of this, as Mary touched upon, with these inequities in funding, and how can leaders really leverage what is already out there to address some of these.
Thank you, Julia, and thanks Superintendent Lane and Mary for what you've laid out. Let me just say that Virginia has capacity that many states do not. And even with that, we see what the challenges are. But when you look in the rural states, in the rural areas where I do a lot of work, in rural Alabama, Mississippi, and Georgia, we have huge capacity issues, not only funding issues, but in terms of the staffing that is needed to develop the kind of planning that is required to even put a cost on what it would take to bring our schools into the 21st century. I think that in terms of inequity, this is one of those situations where when people ask, what do we mean by inequity? That our schools buildings, our school facilities are perfect examples about structural inequity, inequity that's built into the system. Many of the southern states, and as Superintendent Lane talked about, the funding capacity for school facilities is based upon your ability to float a bond and how much money you can get from a bond, from a one millage rate in Clinton, Mississippi, versus what you can get for 1 million, a 1 mil increase in Tunica, Mississippi, for instance, based upon property values and based upon the age of the population and the rurality, the economics of the area. So children located in those districts have challenges to acquiring a 21st century education, regardless of whatever else is going on. In our state capitals, we spend a lot of time having a conversation about how to fund the formula to cover K-12 public education. There's money that comes from the federal level. Of course, then there's money that comes from the state, and then the money that comes through ad valorem taxes. K-12 funding is a battle in and of itself. And then we add into that all of the other kinds of conversations we're having about what quality education needs to look at. And we're having these kind of nibble around the edge conversations when in this country we have a school system and school facilities that are going to make us the most uncompetitive country in the world if we don't pay attention to what we're doing with education and education funding. When businesses are looking at now 20 years out what jobs are going to look like, there is no connection back from that conversation to, okay, so what is happening in our schools to ensure that our children are ready for that economy? And that's clearly not happening in schools where technology, if it exists, you don't have broadband in many areas. And in some school systems, in some school buildings, you don't have your electricity system needs to be totally, your electrical system needs to be totally rebuilt. We've got the HVAC problems that everybody's talked about, and over course of years, due to maintenance issues and safety issues, when windows have been painted shut. So then we enter COVID in a situation where your HVAC is not working, but you can't open the window to get any fresh flow of air. So that from a health perspective, children located in these school districts are facing structural inequity. So now, having said all that, and to Superintendent Lane's point too, there was one school district, a rural school district in Mississippi that was under conservatorship. And the conservator was spending so much money on patching stuff that he asked for and got facilities audit done in that local school district. The audit came back, the report came back that it would be cheaper to rebuild all of those buildings than it would be to try to repair them. In many of these school districts, as we talk about the aging of the school facilities across the country, we have school districts who have to wait months for somebody to try to find a part to go to some plumbing that, you know, people don't even know. You got to go online and try to track down these parts because people don't make them anymore, you know, so you got to wait, you got to, things like that. We have school districts without running water. You know, we have school districts where the students tell us that, that they're concerned about putting their book bags, they don't have lockers. They're concerned about leaving their book bags lying on the floor because they're scared that some animal of some type will crawl into their book bags. So it's one thing to talk about school facilities, just as school facilities. But when you talk about school facilities as the backbone of community and as the way that community says to its young people that we care about you, we care about your education, we want you to be successful in society. And then this is the kind of environment that we put children in, and they don't just stay there. You know, we got sports programs that go across the state. So you send out a football team that's struggling to make its helmets match, and they go into a $5 million complex at another school that was built through a bond. You know, what's that child thinking about on his or her way back home? So it says a lot about where we are. And one of the, just to kind of bring this in, we can funding schools based upon the property value in a geography is the most inequitable thing that you could possibly do to the opportunities for a child. So we need to have a huge conversation about school facilities, about schools and what we want our children to know about the future economy, about how, so all of these things that we're talking about, all of the money though, we're very disappointed in what we're hearing from Washington right now about school facilities, because I don't know, this is as basic as it gets about structural inequity and racism. But with the other money that's out there, how do we corral some of that to at least do some of the major repairs that we need to have done to school facilities, so that they are able to be have some technology advances, and also that until we can do better, children have a place they can go and learn, and they don't have to be negatively impacted in one way or another by the facility that they're in.
Thank you so much, Aletta, and also such a great point about the differences between students traveling between schools. I mean, that's just so critical, the message that we send to students about what do we value, and where are we putting our priorities. So I want to turn over now to a Q&A portion. So those of you who are attending, as I mentioned earlier, please feel free to submit any questions you have into the Q&A. I personally have a number of them, and so have plenty of backup if we don't, if we've got some time, but would love to hear from the audience and hear any questions that you may have. But first, to get us started, Mary, I have a question for you. So urban and rural schools, they're both, as we've discussed, in significant need of capital improvement, but have different needs, face different challenges. Can you outline some of those needs, some of those challenges? And I know we've touched upon those a little bit, but where are those differences? And what suggestions do you have for any policymakers or advocates who are trying to address the needs of both geographies?
Yeah, no, thanks. Really good question, Julia. And I think Superintendent Lane, touched on a little bit. One of the big challenges is, and this is actually true in urban as well as rural schools, where you are declining in enrollment. There tends to be sort of an attitude like, well, why would we invest in that place? They're losing enrollment. But in fact, there's, whether it's 100 kids in a district or whether it's 300 kids in a school that was built in a neighborhood school in the city that was actually originally designed for 500, there are still children there who need modern facilities. And so I think one of the things that was our hope with Rebuild America's Schools, which did not find its way into either the infrastructure bill and has been pretty much dropped from the Build Back Better bill, was that these communities that were very low wealth, very low income, and even if they were losing enrollment, that we would recognize our obligation to provide modern school facilities for these kids. Because the reality is, whether the kids are in rural, urban, suburban communities, whether they're rich or they're poor, they have to live and provide the workforce and the leadership and the talent and the inventions that we're going to need in order to get society sort of functioning in a way that's both survivable as well as cohesive, and so that the aspirations are not different. The needs in terms of what we need in rural schools and urban schools are not different. We need to have early childhood spaces. We need to have good science and technology labs. We need to have healthy environments for all of the occupants. And frankly, we need to have schools that function for the broader community, whether we're in urban or rural communities, and they need to be resilient to some new challenges in terms of whether it's flooding or hurricanes or fires or whatever. There's some new pressures on our schools as it relates to weather related events, but also we moved quickly from school shootings And, we have other kinds of challenges. And one of the things that we really need to see, and this is why I think it's so important, Superintendent Lane, what you're doing, is that we actually need comprehensive ways to address the problems. If we just go in and do the pipes, because there's money in EPA to do lead pipes, and then we go back in because there's $500 million, which is virtually nothing for energy retrofits from the Department of Energy, and you go in and you do an energy project. This is a really expensive way to fix up buildings, and it doesn't address many of the educational needs that, as Dr. Lane talked about, the sort of 21st century learner. There's a lot in common, but I think that the challenge has been that where there's been declining enrollment, it's been neglected at a far, far greater rate than where there's growth in enrollment.
Thank you. And Superintendent Lane, I have a question for you around, this has been brought up multiple times and Mary just mentioned it, this, thinking about 21st century instruction and what will the future workforce needs look like and what do students need to know. And as we're thinking through, how to really advocate for these capital improvement and school infrastructure investments, how can we make sure that we're really considering these adaptations and responding effectively?
Yeah, thank you. I mean, obviously we all are hoping to get to a point where the pandemic is in the rearview mirror, and whatever the new normal looks like, that we're engaging in that. But regardless of what that looks like, we know that students retain information better, are more engaged in school when they have a student-centered approach to the learning environment. And that might include more project-based learning as an example. And our schools weren't built for an environment where students would be presenters and project designers and creators and makers when we built boxes and squares up and down the hallway. Now, the other thing that I would say is probably some of the most poorly designed schools were actually built in the 1970s. So they're not even as old as some of these 1950 schools, but there was a huge movement in the 1970s to do open classrooms. And so I just want to be clear, I'm not necessarily suggesting that, because we didn't see that as successful 40 years ago, but I think it's more about flexible spaces while still maintaining the character of what a classroom looks like. But what happened is a lot of those schools from the 1970s, they've had to erect temporary walls that you can still hear through between facilities, and some school divisions couldn't even afford to put those walls up, and they're just literally having classes right next to each other. I've seen some of those in Virginia. And so for us, I mentioned our facility standards. We're working really hard to keep our facility standards as modern as possible, so that we're not talking about building the most expensive and elaborate schools, but that the basic standards that go into any construction or renovation project are going to lead to an ability for all students to be successful in the school and to be able to access all the variety of resources that we expect to have in a modern day school environment. And so there's a lot there, but ultimately, I think it is about making sure that our schools can allow the type of learning that we know engages students the most.
Thank you. And then Aletta, a question for you. As has been once again been brought up multiple times, and I think you said it yourself. In so many instances, schools are really the centerpiece of a community, and there's so much more happening there than classes and instruction. We had a question in the chat actually from K80 just now talking about how to mitigate teacher shortages, or how to think about that as we're designing new schools or thinking about the needs of the community. And so what are some best practices for really incorporating these community desires, their assets, their needs, whether it's teacher shortages, whether it's events that need to happen in the community? How can we make sure that we're really incorporating that into any plans that are being discussed?
Well, Julia, actually, schools are not as much the center of community that they used to be. And a lot of that is because of the capacity and the resources to keep them open. There is a huge conversation, however, around community schools and getting back to that. But again, you do need to have the facilities to make that palatable. To Kay's question about enticing teachers and what are we gonna do? And there's the facility issue. There's the technology issue that is critical in today's world. States have done everything possible trying to entice teachers to come into school districts that are perched at the intersection of race, poverty, and rurality. And they're not coming. I mean, there are a few, and then there are programs like Teach for America. There are other programs where folks have tried to, offer housing, and some of these school districts, teachers are not coming, and particularly in content areas. So some of the critical content area going forward for a 21st century economy don't have the instruction or the materials, or as Superintendent Lane says, the facility to learn what needs to be learned to be career ready. So I think that the schools are critical. Schools used to be places for adult education, and the children would come during the day and the old people would come at night to learn how to read and to function in the world. Well, we're at that place again. So I think that I think that we really need to have a much broader conversation about how our education system needs to work and what it needs to function in today's world, such that we can curb generational poverty. We can ensure that young people have careers. I mean, they great career centers. Everybody's not going to make it to a community college campus. In some places, community colleges are just aspiring as to communities as China is. But having community schools, having the ability to bring in healthcare providers and to do the things that we need to do, the wraparound services to help children be able to function is critical. But it starts with having a place to go, and that nobody is concerned about any more wear and tear because the maintenance is just not there. So I think that's one of the things that needs to be part of a much broader conversation that includes business, that includes educators, that includes parents and young people. Young people could probably speak to it better than anybody about where are we going in America if we don't educate our children.
Thank you. And I just want to add my 2 cents there. I am a TFA who went to a rural school in South Dakota and on a reservation in a very, very small town, and lived in teacher housing for 3 of my 4 years there. And I can tell you, unfortunately, that was a factor in me deciding to leave the classroom, was the facilities that were being offered to me and the facilities that were being offered to my students, both in my housing and in my school. And so I just want to back up your point there and say that that's a very real thing and something that I myself have experienced. So thank you,
Julia,
for
but let me say, I didn't finish the answer though. So if we're not going to have y'all coming into community, then how do we get those resources? How do we get the teaching and the information that we need into a school district? Everybody is not going to move to a charter school even if they were there. And even with them being there, so far we haven't seen any, great deliverance by charter schools. So the public school district is where our children will be educated. The public schools are going to be what's going to solve our problem. So then how do we get that teacher content in to a school district if the teacher doesn't come? So that's technology. So how are we going to have the kind of the facilities that have the kind of technological resources and classrooms and supportive instruction that will allow our children to get the best 21st century education possible? We've had people come to our region from mission readiness, from the military. We've had, business people talk about, the struggles they're having with finding employees at a certain level. The people can't go in the military now. Nobody's just shooting a gun. You're using technology to drop a bomb. You're using not that I'm for war, but there's nothing that we're going to be doing that is not going to require somebody to have those skills. And if we're not doing it from 8 to 3, what can we be doing after 3 to make sure that young people who are not going off to college are able to get careers that will enable them to take care of themselves and their families? I'm from the Children's Defense Fund. Marion Wright Edelman is president, founder of the Children's Defense Fund, used to say to us all the time, and says still now, that a child without an education is sentenced to economic and social death. It's pretty tough, but it's pretty true. If you don't know how to do something, and you don't know how to, and the economy is moving as fast as it's moving. We talk about a lot of retraining and retooling and all of that. But if we're not preparing people for jobs, if that's not what educate, there's the arts and the liberal arts and all of that. But bottom line is people need to know how to do something to make a living, to take care of themselves and their families. And in fact, that's how we stop generational poverty.
Yeah, thank you. Those are all really good points, and I am going to change the vein just a little bit here because this is actually a question that I have, and this I think can be for all 3 of you or for whoever wants to jump in here. One thing we haven't touched upon here is federally run schools, and as I mentioned, I was on a reservation school that was run by the Bureau of Indian Education. I know in Virginia there's a number of Department of Defense schools, and so just thinking about what do infrastructure investments look like there, and how might those be improved? I'll give an example where I taught for the classroom I was in for 4 years. The window was broken open about 3 inches, and so in a South Dakota winter, that's pretty cold. And I was back there actually this weekend. I got back last night for a community event, and I went to the school and made a joke. Oh, I wonder if my window's been fixed, assuming that in the 4 years since I left, it would have been fixed. Lo and behold, that window is still open 3 inches. So just would love to hear from any of the 3 of you thinking about, federally run schools and how that looks different in terms of infrastructure investment, and, what are some potential ways to improve that process there?
I mean, I can speak to that in that we are a part of a coalition called the Rebuild America School Infrastructure Coalition, which has, the National Association of Federally Impacted Schools in it. We work with the National Council, with the Bureau of Indian Affairs that has a facilities arm. And, you can't, you can't fix that window without the dollars to fix it. And as I, kind of went over that list, it isn't just dollars. You've got to get that prioritized. You've got to have your decision processes. You've got to have somebody held accountable for that daggone window, right? But I think that that part of what's happened is people have been afraid of the numbers. They've been afraid of hearing that we're 85 billion a year short nationally, or that in Virginia we're 24 billion short to modernize the schools. But I think that that's not how you get to the other side of it. And I happen to believe that, you know, as a country, as a people, locally at our state level and with a federal, state and local partnership, you know, really led by local priorities and concerns, that we can get to the other side of this. I don't think we do it by not, you know, measuring and counting what we have and the problems that we have. But what I can see, because we've reached out over many years to school district officials for photos of crumbling schools. And this is where I have to say, Dr. Lane, I was really proud of your crumbling schools tour, because for the most part, there's not a lot of folks that want to show their crumbling schools. You know, as administrators in schools, you don't want to say, oh, I'm delivering education to your children in unhealthy and unsafe buildings. You kind of want to say, well, I've got it. I'm taking care of it. You know, you all don't really need to look at this because I got it, right? Even though they don't, and even though it's not their fault. But so, you know, part of what I think has got to happen is that we have to, in whether it's the federally impacted schools or the all of those local controlled schools, is that people have to open the doors and they have to kind of say, look, this is all of our problem. We're going to have to solve it together. And the school people are going to have to like put their embarrassment out on the table a little bit, and in order to get the help, because it's going to take, I mean, part of why we're not in the infrastructure bill and why we're not, you know, we got dropped out of the you know, when it went from 3.5 trillion down to 1.85 trillion, that we're not in there, is because there is not a groundswell of communities and people saying, no, wait a minute, we need federal, state, local at the table, and we need it in order to deliver the kinds and quality of spaces that we need for our children and for our staff in those schools. And so, but that's not going to happen if, you know, still most people don't have school age children. You know, it is not that many people that are walking in, you know, it's a lot, it's 50 million, you know, plus another 6 million in staff that are going into schools every day, but that's like, 300 million who aren't, right? So we need to be a little more open and less self-conscious, because it really is a structural problem that is built into the system, as Alita's talking about. It's not shame, it's not blame, it's just what it is, and we need to like sit down together and move forward on it. But and I'm optimistic, but it's a little discouraging to see that we did not get that kind of priority in the infrastructure bill or in the Build Back Better. So, you know, we're not done working, but I think, you know, I think we can get there.
I'll just add one thing, Julia, and it's maybe re-emphasizing a point I mentioned earlier. And your story about your window is actually a maintenance issue, not a school construction issue, right? And it won't be enough just to rebuild the schools that need to be built, because after the recession, so many localities and states reduced the funding and operations and maintenance. We're going to have to make sure that we have the money to maintain the facilities once they're built, so that they will be the next generation of schools that might last 50 years or more. Because the worst thing we could do is to build this consensus to rebuild schools, and in 25 years we're having to look at renovations because we didn't take care of it along the way. But I agree with Mary, there's not a superintendent out there that wouldn't replace their school or their window if they had the resources to do so.
Thank you. And I know we just have a couple minutes left, but I just wanted to invite all three of you, and I can kind of go in call on people, but just invite all three of you. If you have any closing thoughts, suggestions. I know I was looking through the attendee list, and we have a number of policymakers on the call, and thinking about thinking about what are your 30-second wrap-ups. What do you want people to really take away from this conversation and think about as they're moving forward in their work? And so just a really quick kind of round robin to sum up some of your thoughts before we close out today. And Oletta, we'll start with you, and then Mary, and close out with Superintendent Lane.
Oh, you caught me off guard. And I, for some reason, what was rambling through my head was America is only as strong as its weakest link. And when it comes to building human capacity, we have to start with our schools. We have to start with our education. And if we want to thrive as a country, we have to start thinking of it collectively, not just as educators, but collectively as a country about what does that take. If you're in the business community, working with the schools to say this is where our jobs are going to be 10 years from now. Okay, so what are we doing in our schools? What do we need to have in our schools to be sure we're moving our children toward that capacity? So I think I would end there.
And I would like to build on that, because don't wait until you have money to vision your future and plan for it, right? So it's going to be really important that communities, and it's cheap to dream, right? And even planning, engaging your community, you can do. I mean, those of us who started out, with grassroots parent organizing, and in my case, student and parent organizing, that you can do that on, some good potluck and, communities getting together. So I think the envisioning and the planning is going to be really important. Use the data that's out there. There's a lot more data than you think there is. But then the other thing in terms of right now with the ESSER dollars, I mean, we have been trying to get the states and the districts to dedicate at least 15% of those dollars towards facility improvements. And part of what I'm afraid of is that people are on the educator side, they're going to say, well, you'll get what's left. And it's very hard to get good decision making, good planning, to get good projects done if you kind of get what's left. If districts now set aside 15 to 20% and say, okay, this is going to be for facilities improvement, give us the plan, the assessment, and work from there, we'll do a whole lot better. But we're, nationally, we're not hearing that that's the way it's going. There's some places where it is, but in general, that's not what's happening. So we really think that you need to do more with the ESSER money that is there on the facility side.
Yeah, and I'll wrap up. I mean, we've tried to provide our school divisions flexibility in the use of those funds when it makes sense, right? And one of the things we talk to our school divisions about is, let's meet these educational recovery needs. But once you've done that, I think that we can talk about a lot of different options in the capital space. But part of where I think we go is, I think that we're just going to have to be really creative about this strategy. Mary made a statement earlier that the numbers really scare people. Well, they're massive, and they do scare people. And so I think that one of the things that we have to do is to start to, even if we make a large investment at some point in time, we've got to come up with sustainable strategies so that once every 25, 30, 50 years, we're not having to go and look for a massive investment to get caught up. If a school costs $25 million at the elementary level, it might be a little bit more than that, 30, 35 in some cases. What if we started to think about policies that set aside $1 million a year, so that over 25 years, we would have the investment that we need? Now, obviously, you'd have to add interest and other things to that. But I think that we're going to have to think about how we can look at surpluses and reverting surpluses into some of these type of capital needs. That may be more of a local and state policy issue than a federal policy issue, but ultimately the strategy where we're going to use debt to incur new buildings is going to continue to be challenging, and it's going to be more challenging in rural communities where the debt capacity just isn't there. I mean, I have communities in Virginia that I think would go to referendum now to build a school, but they don't have the debt capacity to actually be able to borrow the money. And that fiscal stress has to be taken into account as we create these strategies.
Thank you so much. And unfortunately, we're a little bit over time, so I am going to have to wrap us up, even though I'm sure I know we could probably keep this conversation going for the rest of the day. But I just want to again thank Oleta, Mary, and Superintendent Lane for taking the time to be with us here today. If you have any questions for them that weren't answered or that come up later, please do feel free to reach out to any of us here at the Hunt Institute, and we'll make sure to connect you with them or try to get you the resources that we need. So Oleta, Mary, Superintendent, thank you again. Really enjoyed this conversation and really appreciate you taking the time to be here. Just one last minute note, just wanted to let you know about some upcoming webinars that we have here at the Hunt Institute. On Tuesday the 16th, we have our Race and Ed series supporting the formation of ethnic racial identity in early childhood. Should be a really interesting conversation there. Digital Divide on November 18th, lessons learned from the pandemic and long-term considerations. And then finally, our Early Efforts series on December 7th, 2021's big wins for little kids. And I know that they'll be talking about the Build Back Better plan there as well. The website is here. We'll show you the registration link there, as well as any other webinars that we have coming up. But once again, please don't hesitate to reach out to any of us here at the Hunt Institute. And I hope you have a great rest of your day. Thank you.
Thank you.